He had nothing left to lose, and that was exactly what made him dangerous. A former Navy SEAL, broke fighting to keep his kid fed, was walking to the only job interview that stood between him and disaster. Then a woman collapsed in the street, bleeding into the rain, while 50 people pulled out their phones and did absolutely nothing. He had 4 minutes before his interview. He stopped anyway. What he didn't know, what nobody on that sidewalk knew, was that the woman bleeding on the pavement owned the company he was trying to get hired by, and that one decision was about to change both their lives forever. If stories like this hit different for you, hit that subscribe button right now and drop your city or country in the comments. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Give it a like, stay with us until the very end, and don't sleep on what's coming next. The alarm went off at 5:45, same as always, and Ethan Walker was already awake. He'd been lying on his back in the dark for 20 minutes, staring at a water stain on the ceiling of his apartment that he kept meaning to report to the building manager and never did. The stain had grown since October. It was shaped a little like the coast of Florida now, which he figured was the universe's way of being funny, since Florida was about as far from his current situation as he could imagine. He sat up slowly. His left knee protested, the way it always did in cold weather, a souvenir from a training exercise in Coronado that had gone sideways 12 years ago. The doctors had told him it would loosen up over time. They'd been technically correct. It loosened up around noon most days, which didn't help much at 5:45 in the morning in a Chicago November. The apartment was small, 2 bedrooms, 1 bath, a kitchen where the overhead light flickered when the refrigerator kicked on. The carpet in the hallway had a worn path down the center from years of other people living here before him, and the radiator in the living room made a sound like a man trying to clear his throat every time the heat came on. Ethan had stopped noticing most of it. You stopped noticing things when you were focused on not drowning. He padded down the hall in his socks and pushed open the second bedroom door quietly. His daughter, Maya, was 7 years old, and she slept the way she did everything, with complete commitment. She was on her stomach with her arms spread wide, 1 foot hanging off the edge of the mattress, her dark hair covering most of her face. A stuffed dog named Captain was tucked under her chin. Captain had been with her since she was 2. He'd lost an eye somewhere around year 4 and had a tear along his left ear that Ethan had stitched closed, himself using a suture kit he'd kept from his kit bag, which Maya had found enormously impressive. Ethan stood in the doorway for a moment. Just that. Standing there, watching her sleep. He did this most mornings. He wasn't sure why exactly. Maybe because it was the one part of his day that felt completely solid. Everything else had a way of shifting. He went to the kitchen and started the coffee. While it brewed, he sat at the small table by the window and laid out what he had. The suit was already hanging on the back of the bedroom door. His one good suit, a navy blue thing he'd bought 3 years ago for his brother-in-law's wedding and worn exactly twice since then. He'd taken it to the dry cleaner last week, which had cost him $14 he didn't have to spare, and he'd pressed the shirt himself the night before with an iron that kept spitting rust-colored water if you tilted it wrong. The interview was at 9 o'clock sharp. Hayes Dynamics, 42nd floor of the Meridian Tower on West Monroe. Corporate Security Director, the kind of position he was actually qualified for, the kind that required the specific and somewhat unusual combination of tactical thinking, risk assessment, and the ability to stay calm when things went genuinely wrong. Skills he had in abundance. Skills that had not, in the 3 years since his discharge, translated into steady employment as smoothly as he'd hoped. He pulled the printed confirmation email from under the fruit bowl, a habit from the service, keeping paper backups, and read it again even though he'd already memorized it. Interview confirmed. Thursday, November 14th. 9 a.m., Mr. Ethan Walker. Asked for Patricia at reception. 3 years. That was how long he'd been doing this. Sending out applications, getting callbacks, making it through first rounds and second rounds and sometimes third rounds, and then hitting the wall that every veteran eventually hits. The moment when some HR coordinator looked at his resume and saw the gap between military service and the present and made a decision about what that gap meant without asking him directly. He'd done contract security work. 2 stints. One for a private firm out of Virginia that had been fine until it wasn't, and one for a property management company that had paid him to walk a parking garage at night and had made him feel, for the first time in his life, genuinely invisible. He'd also driven for a rideshare company for 8 months and done a semester of community college coursework in cybersecurity before the tuition got out of reach, and helped his neighbor haul furniture on weekends for cash. None of it was enough. Not with rent, not with Maya's after-school program, not with the fact that the car had needed a new alternator in September, and the alternator had gone on a credit card that was already carrying a balance he didn't like to think about. He wasn't a man who allowed himself much self-pity. The Navy had drilled that out of him early and efficiently, and what the Navy hadn't gotten, life had. But sitting at that kitchen table in the early morning dark, listening to the radiator clear its throat and the coffee finish brewing, Ethan Walker was tired in a way that went past his body and his knee and his interrupted sleep. He was tired in the way that came from trying hard for a long time without much to show for it. He poured the coffee. He drank it standing at the counter. At 7:15, he woke Maya up. She surfaced from sleep the way she always did, slowly, with complaints, one arm thrown over her face as though the ceiling light was personally offensive. "Dad." "Morning, Captain." "It's too early. It's 7:15. "That's what I said." He sat on the edge of her bed and she squinted up at him through her hair. She had her mother's eyes, dark brown, slightly too serious for a 7-year-old, and his jaw, which he felt vaguely guilty about. He'd hoped she'd gotten more of her mother's face. "You have school," he said. "I know." She sat up and reached automatically for Captain. "Are you wearing your suit?" "Not yet. Later." "Because of the interview?" "Yeah." She considered this with the gravity that she applied to most things. "Are you nervous?" "A little," he said, which was the honest answer. He could admit it to her in a way he couldn't admit it to most people. "You want eggs or cereal?" "Eggs," she said. "Can you do the thing where you put cheese in them?" "I can do that." "Dad?" He was already standing up. He looked back at her. "You're going to get it," she said. Simple, like she'd checked the math. He didn't say what he was thinking, which was that he'd been told that before, by himself, and by her, and by his sister, and by his friend Dominguez, who called from San Diego every few weeks to check in. He didn't say that the hoping was almost worse than not hoping. He just nodded at her and went to make the eggs. The rain started around 8. Not a dramatic rain. No thunder, no driving sheets of it. Just a steady gray Chicago November rain that soaked through everything gradually and made the streets smell like wet concrete and exhaust. Ethan had an umbrella that he almost forgot and remembered at the last second, which he chose to take as a good sign. He'd arranged for Mrs. Okafor from across the hall to walk Maya to the bus stop. Mrs. Okafor was 63, retired, and had opinions about everything, which Ethan had learned to navigate around in the same way you navigated around furniture in the dark, slowly and with your hands out. But she was reliable, and she liked Maya, and Maya liked her back, and that was worth more than he could put a price on. He kissed the top of Maya's head while she was still working on her backpack. She tolerated this. "Pay attention in math," he said. "I always pay attention in math." "You told me math was boring." "I pay attention to boring things too," she said, like this was obvious. He left the apartment at 8:10. He had 50 minutes to get downtown, which was enough time to take the L and walk from the Clinton stop, factoring in the rain slowing things down. He'd run the route twice in his head and once on Google Maps. He was not a person who arrived late to things. He'd been not late for so long that it had stopped feeling like a virtue and just felt like the baseline of existing. The L was crowded and damp and smelled like wet coats. He stood holding the rail and went through what he planned to say in the interview the way you ran through a pre-mission brief, not memorizing a script, but getting clear on the key points, the things he needed to communicate regardless of what they asked him. He knew his background. He knew what he'd done. The problem had always been translating it into language that fit inside a conference room. "Tell me about your leadership experience." 13 years, U.S. Navy, Special Operations, 2 combat deployments, led a 12-man team in environments where the cost of a wrong decision wasn't a lost account or a delayed project. It was a body bag. I know how to stay functional when the information is incomplete and the situation is changing and the stakes are as high as they get. I know how to make a call, live with it, and move on to the next one. He'd learned not to say it exactly like that. He'd learned to sand the edges down, make it more palatable for people who'd never had to make that kind of call. But somewhere under the sanded down version, that was the truth, and he needed them to see it. He got off at Clinton and put the umbrella up and walked. It was 8:48 when he turned onto West Monroe. The Meridian Tower was visible from 2 blocks away, 40-something stories of glass and steel going up into low cloud cover, the kind of building that was designed to make you feel small when you walk toward it. Ethan didn't feel small. He'd learned through significant effort to walk toward large and intimidating things without breaking stride. He was a block and a half away when he heard it. Not a crash exactly, more of a compressed impact, the kind of sound that your nervous system registers before your brain catches up. Then a woman's voice, somewhere in front of him, cutting off mid-sentence. Then the specific silence that follows something going wrong. He was moving before he'd consciously decided to move. That was training. 11 years of it. Your body decided and your brain caught up later. The intersection was half a block ahead, and by the time he reached the corner, he could already see what had happened. A rideshare vehicle, dark blue sedan, Chachim, had come around the corner faster than it should have in the rain and caught a woman stepping off the curb. She'd gone down hard. Not a direct hit, more of a glancing blow that had pitched her off her feet and sent her head into the corner of a concrete planter box on the sidewalk edge. She was on the ground, on her side, and the blood was already coming. Ethan took in the scene in the flat, automatic way he'd been trained to. The driver was out of the car, standing a few feet away, phone already in hand, looking at the woman with the specific paralyzed expression of someone whose brain had stopped processing. 4 or 5 bystanders had formed a loose ring around the scene. No one was doing anything. They were doing the modern thing, phones up, recording, waiting for someone else to act. He checked his watch. 8:51, 9 minutes. The woman on the ground made a sound, not words, just a sound, the kind that meant consciousness was in there but struggling. Blood was spreading on the wet pavement under her head. Her coat was expensive, dark gray, probably cashmere, and it was soaking through. 8:51. He looked at the Meridian Tower. He could see it from here. 42nd floor, Patricia at reception, the suit he'd dry cleaned for $14. Maya at the kitchen table saying, "You're going to get it," with that matter-of-fact certainty. He looked at the woman. Her hand moved, palm flat against the pavement, like she was trying to push herself up, and her body wasn't cooperating. Ethan folded his umbrella and went to his knees beside her. "Hey," he said, "don't try to get up. Don't move your head." His voice was calm. He'd learned to make his voice calm regardless of what was happening inside him. It was a skill like any other skill. "Can you hear me?" She made the sound again. Her eyes were open but not focused, the way eyes got when the brain was briefly offline. "You're okay. You're going to be okay. Just stay still." He looked up at the ring of bystanders. He found the driver who was still standing there with his phone. "You call 911 right now if you haven't already. Tell them we have a head injury, she's conscious. We need an ambulance at..." He looked up at the street sign. "Monroe and Wells, go." The driver blinked and started talking into his phone. Ethan shrugged off his jacket, his one good jacket, the one that went with the suit, and folded it and pressed it gently against the cut on her forehead. The cut was ugly, but not deep enough to be immediately life-threatening. Head wounds bled like they were trying to make a point. He knew that. He'd seen worse on days he didn't like thinking about. "What's your name?" he asked her. She blinked at him. Her eyes were starting to focus. Dark eyes, he registered. Her lipstick was red and completely at odds with the rest of the situation. "Victoria," she said, barely above a whisper. "Victoria. Okay. I'm Ethan. I'm going to stay with you until the ambulance gets here. You took a hit to the head, so I need you to stay still for me, okay? Can you do that?" She looked at him for a moment. Something moved through her expression that he couldn't quite read. Surprise, maybe. Or just the disorientation of trying to make sense of a situation from flat on your back on a wet sidewalk. "Okay," she said. He kept the jacket pressed to her head and talked to her, steady and even, the way you talked to someone when you needed them to stay with you. He asked her simple questions. Her name again, what day she thought it was, where she was going. He wasn't doing it to get information. He was doing it because keeping her talking meant keeping her conscious, and keeping her conscious was the only job right now. Around him, the bystanders had mostly dispersed, their phones back in their pockets now that someone else had taken charge of the situation. The driver was off to the side talking to a 911 dispatcher. The rain kept coming down. Ethan didn't check his watch again, not because he'd forgotten about the interview. He hadn't. He was aware of the minutes passing in the way you're aware of a radio playing in another room. But he'd made the decision the moment he went to his knees, and making a decision again didn't do anything except split your attention. So he stayed where he was, jacket pressed to her head, rain coming down on his white dress shirt, soaking through to his shoulders. One hand flat on the wet pavement beside her to steady himself, feeling the cold work into his palm. "The ambulance will be here soon," he told her. She was looking at him with more focus now. The initial shock was clearing, replaced by something more alert and, he thought, more like herself. Whatever that meant for a woman he'd met 40 seconds ago. "You're soaking wet," she said. He almost laughed. Under the circumstances, it was the most ordinary observation she could have made. "Yeah," he said. "Little bit." "You don't have to." "I'm staying," he said. Matter of fact, not a discussion. She looked at him a moment longer. Then she closed her eyes and he said, "Hey," and she opened them again. "Sorry," she said. "Dizzy." "I know." "Eyes open. Talk to me." "What do you want to talk about?" "Anything you want." A pause. Her breathing was steadying out, which was a good sign. "What were you doing before this?" she asked. He thought about the Meridian Tower, Patricia at reception, the 42nd floor. "Walking to work," he said, which was technically accurate. The ambulance arrived 7 minutes later. The paramedics were efficient and professional, the way paramedics in a city learn to be, and Ethan stepped back and gave them space and answered their questions about what he'd seen and what he'd assessed. One of them glanced at his soaked dress shirt and the ruined jacket he was still holding and gave him a look that was partly professional evaluation and partly simple human acknowledgement. "She's lucky you were here," the paramedic said. Ethan nodded once. He wasn't sure luck was the right word for any part of what had just happened, but he understood what the man meant. He stood on the wet sidewalk and watched them load Victoria into the ambulance. Just before the doors closed, she turned her head and found him in the small crowd, and she looked at him the way people look at someone they're trying to commit to memory. Then the doors closed. Ethan stood there for another moment. His shirt was plastered to him. The jacket was beyond saving. He looked down the street toward the Meridian Tower, visible between two buildings, its upper floors lost in the clouds. He took his phone out and found the number on the confirmation email and called it. It rang 4 times before a woman answered. "Hayes Dynamics, how can I help you?" "This is Ethan Walker," he said. "I had a 9 o'clock interview. I need to let you know I'm not going to make it." A pause. "I see. Can I ask why?" He thought about how to explain it. "There was an emergency on my way in," he said. "Someone needed help." Another pause, longer this time. "I'm sorry to hear that, Mr. Walker. I'll pass that along to the hiring team." "Thank you," he said. "I apologize for the inconvenience." He hung up. The rain had settled into the kind of gray, tireless persistence that suggested it had all day and didn't plan to rush anything. He started walking back to the L. His knee was complaining again. His shirt was ruined. His jacket was ruined. He had, by any reasonable measure, just walked away from the best opportunity he'd had in 3 years. But he thought about the way Victoria had said his name when she was trying to commit his face to memory. He thought about her hand on the wet pavement, and the dizzy apology, and the blood soaking through his jacket. He thought about Maya at the kitchen table. "You're going to get it." He thought about what the paramedic had said. He walked home in the rain, shoulders straight, jaw set, the ruined jacket under his arm, and he told himself what he always told himself when things went sideways, that you did what you could with what you had, and then you kept moving. You kept moving. That was the only thing there was. The dry cleaner's name was Mr. Ewan, and he was a small, precise man in his 60s who had been running the same shop on West Jackson for 22 years. He looked at the jacket Ethan laid on the counter, the blood-stained, rain-soaked, completely destroyed jacket, and was quiet for a long moment. "This is bad," Mr. Ewan said. "I know. The blood set in already. In this fabric," he turned it over, examined the lining. "I can try. No promises." "How much?" $22? Maybe I get something out, maybe not. Ethan didn't have $22 to spend on a jacket that was probably unsalvageable. He also didn't have the bandwidth at this particular moment to make that calculation out loud. "Okay," he said. "Try." He walked home in the rain without an umbrella because he'd left it somewhere on Monroe Street and hadn't noticed until he was 3 blocks away. By the time he got back to the apartment, it was past 10:30, and Mrs. Okafor had gone back across the hall, and the place was empty in the particular way apartments get empty in the middle of a weekday. Not peaceful exactly, just hollow. He changed out of the wet clothes. He hung the dress shirt on a hanger and stood looking at it for a moment, the way you look at something you're not ready to throw away but can't figure out what else to do with. Then he went to the kitchen and poured the last of the morning coffee into a mug and heated it in the microwave and sat down at the table. He'd missed the interview. He sat with that for a while, the way you sit with a bruise, not poking at it, just being aware of it. The Hayes Dynamics position had taken 6 weeks from first application to interview confirmation. 6 weeks of a specific, low-grade hope that he'd been careful not to let get too large. He told himself it was just one more interview, one more shot among many. He told himself that and mostly believed it. Mostly. His phone was on the table. He looked at it without picking it up. The thing about being broke and a single father simultaneously was that there was never a clean moment to feel bad about your own situation, because the situation was always also someone else's, specifically a 7-year-old's, and you couldn't afford to let yourself get too far into it. He had an afternoon before Maya got home from school. He would spend it the way he'd spent a lot of afternoons, on the laptop, on job boards, sending applications into the digital equivalent of a very quiet room. He picked up his phone and called Dominguez. Marcus Dominguez had been his team's second-in-command for 3 years and had gotten out 8 months before Ethan, and had landed through a combination of timing and contacts and what Ethan privately considered to be the kind of luck that didn't come around twice, a position with a cybersecurity firm in San Diego that paid him more than either of them had ever made in uniform. He was also one of maybe 4 people in Ethan's life who he could call without having to perform being fine. It rang twice. "Walker, how'd it go?" "I didn't make it." A pause. "What happened?" Ethan told him. The whole thing. The intersection, the woman, the blood on the pavement, the ambulance, the call to Patricia at reception to say he wasn't coming. He told it straight, without editorializing, the way he'd been trained to report a situation. When he finished, there was a silence on the other end. "You absolute idiot," Dominguez said. But his voice wasn't hard. It was the specific tone of someone who wasn't actually surprised. "Yeah. You couldn't just—" He stopped. "No, never mind. Of course you couldn't. I don't know why I'm even starting that sentence." Another pause. "Was she okay? The woman? Conscious when they put her in the ambulance? Head laceration, possible concussion? She seemed oriented, talking." "Okay." He could hear Dominguez thinking. "So what's the plan?" "Same plan. Keep looking." "I can ask around here again. Bartkowski's been talking about expanding his team. San Diego's a long move with Maya in school." "I know. I'm just saying there are options." "I know there are options," Ethan said, and he heard the edge in his own voice and pulled it back. "Sorry, I know. I'm just—" He stopped. "You're allowed to be pissed off, man. I'm not pissed off." "Walker. He looked at the dress shirt hanging on the hanger. "I'm tired of starting over," he said, and that was the truest thing he'd said out loud in a while. Dominguez didn't try to fix it. He just said, "I know," and let it sit there, and that was what made him worth calling. They talked for another 20 minutes, mostly about nothing. Dominguez's daughter's soccer team, a movie they'd both been meaning to watch. Whether Chicago winters were actually worse than San Diego people thought, or if Dominguez had just gotten soft. By the time Ethan hung up, he felt incrementally more like himself, which was the best you could realistically hope for from a phone call. He opened the laptop and started over. Maya came home at 3:15 and read his face with the accuracy that 7-year-olds develop when they spend enough time paying close attention to one adult. "You didn't get it," she said. "I didn't go," he said. He decided on the walk home that he wasn't going to lie to her or soften it into something unrecognizable. She was 7, not naive. Something happened on the way. Someone got hurt and needed help. She set her backpack down. She was still in her coat and rain boots, and she had a piece of paper sticking out of her front zipper pocket that was probably a permission slip he was going to forget about until the last possible moment. She thought about what he'd said with the seriousness she applied to most things. "Did they get better?" "I think so. The ambulance came." She nodded slowly. Then she went to the kitchen and got herself a glass of water, the way she'd started doing recently, just helping herself, doing the small things without asking. A quiet confidence that he was proud of and also found slightly heartbreaking because he knew where it came from. Kids who grew up with one tired parent got self-sufficient early. "There'll be other interviews," she said, from the kitchen. He hadn't said that to her. She was saying it to him. "Yeah," he said. "There will be." She came back and sat across from him at the table and pulled Captain out of her backpack pocket, which she wasn't supposed to bring to school, but consistently did. "Can we have grilled cheese tonight?" "Yeah," he said. "We can do that." She started on her homework. He went back to the laptop. Outside, the rain had finally stopped, and the late afternoon light came through the window in a thin gray-silver strip across the table, and the radiator in the living room cleared its throat, and that was the rest of Thursday. The call came Friday morning. Ethan was in the middle of his push-ups, 100 a day, every day, a habit he'd kept from the service as the kind of thing you held onto when other structures fell away. When his phone buzzed on the nightstand, he finished the set before he picked it up. Unknown number, Chicago area code. "Walker," he answered. "Mr. Ethan Walker?" The voice was professional, female, efficiently pleasant. "That's me?" "This is Diane Holloway calling from Hayes Dynamics. I'm reaching out on behalf of our executive office. Would you be available to come in and speak with us today?" He sat up from the floor. He'd been expecting maybe a standard rejection form, auto-generated, sent with the impersonal efficiency of a company that had 30 other candidates to move through. Not this. "Today?" "At your convenience, yes. We're flexible on time. The request comes directly from our CEO's office." Something shifted in his chest, not quite excitement, more like the sensation of the ground becoming less certain under your feet. "What would this meeting be about?" A very slight pause. "I'm afraid I don't have all the details. I was simply asked to extend the invitation and arrange the meeting. Would 2 o'clock work for you?" He looked at the bedroom doorway. Maya was already at school. He had nothing on this afternoon except a job board and a permission slip he'd finally found and signed the night before. 2 o'clock works, he said. "Wonderful. Please ask for me at reception. Diane Holloway, 42nd floor." He hung up and sat on the edge of the bed and thought about the 42nd floor and the woman named Victoria who'd looked at him just before the ambulance doors closed. Dark eyes, red lipstick, trying to commit his face to memory. He got up and looked at the dress shirt on the hanger. The right shoulder was still faintly stained from where the rain had driven the blood in. He turned it so that side would be against his body and decided it would have to do. The lobby of Meridian Tower was everything the outside promised. Marble floors, high ceilings, the particular kind of aggressive quiet that expensive buildings cultivated deliberately. The security desk had 3 people behind it and a sign-in procedure that Ethan observed with professional attention. The camera placements were decent, but had 2 blind spots he clocked automatically without meaning to. Old habit. He gave his name to the guard and was handed a visitor badge and directed to the elevators. He rode up to 42 alone, watching the floor numbers climb, and did the thing he'd learned to do before operations. He let his mind go quiet. Not blank. Just quiet. Whatever was about to happen, he'd deal with it when he knew what it was. The elevator opened into a reception area that was deliberately understated. Less look at our money, and more we don't need to try. Clean lines, good furniture, a single large abstract painting on the wall that cost more than his rent. Diane Holloway was waiting for him, exactly as professional as her phone voice, late 40s, wearing the particular expression of an executive assistant who knew more than she was allowed to say and had made peace with that a long time ago. "Mr. Walker," she extended her hand, "thank you for coming." "Thanks for the invitation." She led him down a hallway past glass-walled conference rooms and offices, most of them occupied by people in the quiet, concentrated state of people who felt comfortable in these rooms. Ethan kept his pace easy. He'd learned not to let environments intimidate him into adjusting his stride. She stopped at a set of double doors at the end of the hall. "Just through here," she said, and pushed the right door open and stepped back. The boardroom was large and faced west, and even on a gray November afternoon, the view through those windows was substantial. City grid, the river, the lakefront in the middle distance. The conference table was long enough to seat 20, though only a handful of the chairs were occupied. Ethan took in the room in the few seconds before anyone spoke. 4 people seated, various positions around the table. One person standing at the window. The person at the window turned. Victoria Hayes looked considerably better than she had on the wet pavement of Monroe Street, which Ethan acknowledged was a low bar. The cut on her forehead had been treated and was covered by a thin dressing above her left eyebrow. She was wearing a suit the color of charcoal, and her dark hair was pulled back, and she was looking at him with an expression he couldn't immediately categorize. He recognized her anyway. The eyes were the same. "Mr. Walker," she said, "thank you for coming." He'd had about 20 seconds to absorb this, which wasn't a lot and was going to have to be enough. He kept his face even. "Miss Hayes, you know who I am." "I didn't yesterday. I looked up Hayes Dynamics after your office called this morning." He paused. "I figured it was worth knowing what I was walking into." Something in her expression shifted. Very slightly, the kind of shift you'd miss if you weren't paying attention. A kind of recalibration. "Please, sit down." He pulled out a chair and sat, and she came away from the window and took the chair at the head of the table, and the other people in the room rearranged themselves slightly without anyone saying anything. The specific choreography of people who knew their positions relative to each other without having to think about it. "These are members of my executive team," Victoria said, gesturing briefly. "James Reyes, Chief Operating Officer. Linda Marsh, Head of HR, Paul Denton, our General Counsel. And I believe you've spoken with Diane." Ethan nodded at each of them. They nodded back with varying levels of warmth. The man she'd introduced as James Reyes had the kind of face that was professionally neutral without working too hard at it. Linda Marsh had a notepad in front of her that she was not currently writing on. Paul Denton looked like he was waiting to see which way the wind went before he decided anything. "I owe you an explanation," Victoria said, "and probably an apology." "You don't owe me anything. You missed your interview because of me." "I missed my interview because I stopped to help someone who was hurt," Ethan said. "Those are different things." She looked at him for a moment. "That's a generous distinction." "It's an accurate one." The room was quiet for a moment. Reyes wrote something on the legal pad in front of him without looking up. Marsh shifted in her chair. "I'd like to explain what happened from my side," Victoria said, "if you don't mind." "Go ahead." She'd been in a car, she told him. Not a rideshare, but a company vehicle, driven by her regular driver, who'd had to take a different route because of a street closure. She'd gotten out 2 blocks from the tower because she needed air, which was something she did sometimes, walked the last few blocks to clear her head before the day started. It was a habit she'd had for years. Her security team knew about it and had opinions about it. "They're not wrong," she said dryly, as yesterday demonstrated. She'd seen the car coming. She'd stepped back, but the curb was uneven, and she'd gone down instead of back, and then she hadn't been conscious of much for a little while. When she'd become aware again, Ethan was there. "I want to be clear about what I observed," she said, and there was something deliberate in her voice now, the voice of someone who was used to being precise in boardrooms. "You were in a suit, a good suit. You were walking with purpose, which usually means someone running late. You got on your knees in the rain next to a stranger you'd never met, and you gave her your jacket, and you stayed. You didn't ask who I was. You didn't look for a wallet or an ID. You just—" She paused. You just stayed. Ethan said nothing. I found out later who had the 9 o'clock interview. My assistant pulls all the day's appointments. When I saw your name and the time, she stopped again. She glanced at Reyes briefly, then back at Ethan. I asked about you, your application, your background. I read your file myself. What did my file tell you? 13 years in the Navy, special operations. She said it without the kind of slightly reverential fumbling that civilians sometimes did with that information. Just clean. 2 deployments. A commendation for an incident in 2016 that your file describes in terms that suggest the language was deliberately flattened to make the actual events sound more routine than they were. He didn't confirm or deny that. After discharge, contract security work, some coursework, gap periods that your application explains in language I recognize as the language of someone who's used to being asked to justify themselves. She paused. Single father, 1 daughter, age 7. Her name is Maya, he said. He wasn't sure why he said it. It just felt wrong to have her be reduced to an age and a number. Victoria nodded. Maya, she repeated, like she was filing it away. What is this meeting about, Ms. Hayes? He said. Not rudely, just directly. I'd like to offer you a position with Hayes Dynamics. He kept his face even. He'd suspected this was coming for the last 10 minutes, and he'd still needed the 10 minutes to get ready for it. What position? We had the corporate security director role open. That's what you interviewed for, or were going to interview for. But in the last 12 hours, I've been rethinking the structure of that team. She glanced at Reyes again, and Reyes nodded without looking up from his pad. There's a broader role that's been undefined for a while, risk and security operations. It encompasses the security director function, but also crisis management, operational resilience, the kind of role that requires someone who can think under pressure and make good decisions when the information is incomplete. What does it pay? He said. Beside him, he sensed Marsh tense slightly. People weren't supposed to ask that in the first 30 seconds. Victoria, however, didn't blink. Linda has a packet for you with the full compensation structure. Salary, equity participation, benefits. The short answer is that it pays enough. Enough for what? To not have to worry about whether your daughter has what she needs. She said it without softness and without sharpness, just as a fact. I had your financial background reviewed as part of your file. I know where you are. That landed differently than he expected. Not offense, exactly. More like the discomfort of having someone see clearly something you'd worked hard to keep contained to yourself. That's a lot of information to gather about someone in 12 hours, he said. I have resources. I noticed. A beat. I need to ask you something directly, Ethan said. Please. Is this about what happened yesterday? Because I need to know if that's what this is. The question sat in the air. Denton shifted in his chair. Marsh made a small mark on her notepad. Victoria looked at Ethan for a long moment before she answered, and he gave her credit for not rushing it, for letting the question have its full weight before she spoke. I won't tell you that what happened yesterday didn't bring you to my attention, she said. That would be dishonest, and I don't think dishonesty serves either of us here. But I want to be equally clear about something. I did not build this company on sentiment. I have made bad hiring decisions, and I have made good ones. And the difference between them has consistently been one thing: character. I have spent 11 years learning to recognize it quickly when I see it. A pause. What I saw yesterday, on that sidewalk, was a man who made a decision when it was genuinely costly to him, who did not look for a camera, who did not try to use the situation, who stayed because it was the right thing to do. And then when my office called, he came back and he asked the right questions, and he didn't flinch when I told him I'd read his file. She folded her hands on the table. That is the information I'm making this decision based on. What happened yesterday provided the opportunity to gather it. It is not the reason for the offer. Ethan sat with that. The view out the window was still the same. City grid, river, the flat gray November sky sitting on everything. Somewhere down there, 42 floors below, was the intersection where he'd spent the better part of Thursday morning on his knees in the rain. I have a daughter, he said finally. Making decisions that affect her requires more than 12 hours. Of course. I'd want to review the compensation package, understand the actual scope of the role. Talk to Reyes about what the team looks like. All of that can be arranged, Victoria said, and I want to be clear about one thing. He looked at her directly. If I take this position, I take it to do the job. I don't owe favors. I don't operate on the assumption that our personal history creates any particular dynamic. I do the work the way I know how to do it, and I expect to be evaluated on that. Something crossed her face. Not offense. Something more like satisfaction. The expression of someone who'd asked a question and gotten the answer they were looking for. That is, she said, exactly what I'm hoping for. Reyes looked up from his legal pad for the first time since the meeting started. He had the eyes of someone who watched, and he'd been watching Ethan with the particular attention of someone who was forming a view and hadn't finished forming it yet. The security team is 9 people currently, Reyes said. 2 of them are strong. The rest are competent. We had a review 2 months ago that identified gaps in our crisis protocols. The role would involve rebuilding some of that infrastructure. He said it without softness, the tone of someone presenting a situation rather than selling it. It won't be easy. I haven't been looking for easy, Ethan said. Reyes made a small sound that might have been the beginning of a laugh. He looked back down at his pad. Marsh slid the compensation packet across the table without ceremony, and Ethan picked it up and scanned the first page. He didn't let his expression change, but something in his chest shifted, the specific shift of a number that was real landing against the reality of his life. He set the packet down. I'll let you know by Monday, he said. Monday is fine, Victoria said. He stood. She stood. The others shifted in their chairs. He shook hands around the table. Reyes firm and direct. Marsh with a professional warmth. Denton with the careful grip of a lawyer. And then Victoria walked him to the door herself, which he hadn't expected. In the hallway, before Diane could materialize to escort him back, Victoria stopped him. Mr. Walker. He turned. She looked at him for a moment with those dark eyes that had been half-focused and frightened on the wet pavement yesterday, and were now clear and direct and entirely in command of themselves. For what it's worth, she said, quietly enough that it wasn't for the room, I know what it cost you, what you did yesterday. I don't take it lightly. He looked at her. She was 30 years old and ran a company worth a number he didn't want to think about too hard. And she was standing in a hallway telling him she knew what a ruined jacket and a missed interview meant to a man in his situation. He didn't know quite what to do with that. The woman was hurt, he said simply. That was the situation. She held his gaze. Yes, she said, that's what I mean. He rode the elevator down alone again and walked out through the marble lobby and back out onto West Monroe, where the puddles from yesterday's rain were still sitting in the low places of the sidewalk, and the air was cold and tasted like the lake. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment before he started moving. He thought about calling Dominguez. He thought about the compensation packet he was carrying in his left hand. He thought about what Victoria Hayes had said about character and about decisions that were costly, and about the difference between the reason for the offer and the opportunity to gather the information. He thought about Maya that morning, eating her cereal, asking if she could come to his work sometime, the way she did sometimes. Whenever you get a job, can I come see it? With the flat certainty that it would happen eventually, the same certainty she'd had at the kitchen table Thursday morning. You're going to get it. He started walking toward the L. The city moved around him the way it always did. Indifferent, enormous, full of people going their own directions at their own speeds, cabs and buses and people with their heads down and their collars up against the cold. Chicago, on a gray Friday afternoon, carrying on the way Chicago always carried on, with the specific low-grade stubbornness of a city that had been knocked down enough times to stop being surprised by it. He walked through all of it, the compensation packet in his hand, and by the time he reached the L station, he hadn't made a decision yet. But he knew, in the way you know things that your body registers before your brain catches up, that he was going to. He took the stairs down to the platform, 2 at a time, because he was going to be home before Maya got off the bus, and he wanted to be there when she came through the door. He told Maya over grilled cheese. Not everything. She was 7, and there were parts of it that would either confuse her or make her ask questions he wasn't ready to answer yet. But the basic shape of it, that the woman he'd helped on the street turned out to be someone important, and that she'd offered him a job, and that he was thinking it over. Maya listened with a piece of grilled cheese halfway to her mouth, which was the clearest indication he had that she considered this significant. "The same company?" she said. "The same company. The one you were going to interview at?" "Yeah." She put the grilled cheese down. She looked at the table for a moment with the expression she got when she was working something out. A small vertical line between her eyebrows that was going to become a permanent feature in about 20 years, if his own forehead was any evidence. Then she looked up. "So you helped her," she said. "And then she gave you the job." "She offered me the job. I haven't said yes yet." "Why not?" It was a fair question, and the honest answer was complicated in ways that were hard to translate to a 7-year-old without sounding like he was looking for reasons to fail. So he said, "I want to make sure it's the right fit. You don't take a job just because someone offers it to you." Maya considered this. Is it a good job? He thought about the number on the first page of the compensation packet. "Yeah," he said, "it's a good job." "Then why are you still thinking?" He picked up his own grilled cheese. "Eat your dinner." She gave him the look that meant she'd registered the non-answer and was filing it away for later, then went back to eating. That night, after she was in bed and Captain was tucked under her chin and the apartment had settled into its nighttime sounds, Ethan sat at the kitchen table with the compensation packet spread out in front of him and his laptop open beside it. He went through it the same way he'd go through any document with significant stakes, methodically, looking for what wasn't there as much as what was. The salary was real, more than he'd made at any point since leaving the service, including the contract work. Benefits, full package. Equity that would take 4 years to vest, which was standard, and which was the kind of long-term assumption he hadn't been in a position to make about any job in 3 years. The role description was deliberately broad in some places, and very specific in others, which was consistent with what Reyes had told him. An infrastructure that needed rebuilding, a team that needed direction, a scope that would expand as he demonstrated what he could do. He sat with the document until close to midnight. Then he closed the laptop and went to bed. He called Victoria's office first thing Monday morning and told Diane to let Ms. Hayes know he was accepting. That was the easy part. But the first day was a Monday in late November, gray and cold in the specific way Chicago got in the weeks before December made everything official. Ethan arrived at 7:45, which was 15 minutes before his stated start time, which felt right to him. Early enough to be taken seriously, but not so early that it looked like he was trying to compensate for something. Diane had a badge ready for him and walked him through the building orientation herself, which he suspected was not standard practice for new hires, but didn't comment on. The 42nd floor was where the executive offices lived. The security team operated on 38, and that was where she left him. In front of a suite of offices that had the functional, low-glamour feel of a department that had been told to get the job done with the budget that remained after the better-looking floors were furnished. The team was 9 people, 6 men, 3 women. Ages ranging from mid-20s to a guy named Bernard, who had to be close to 60, and who looked at Ethan's entrance with the patient, calibrated expression of a man who had outlasted several previous directors and expected to outlast this one too. They were assembled in the main room, a conference space that doubled as an operations center, with monitors on one wall and a table that had seen better days, and a whiteboard someone had half erased and not finished the job. They knew he was coming. They had the look of people who'd been told to be present and were doing exactly that, and nothing more. He introduced himself without ceremony. Name, background, abbreviated, former Navy, some contract work, now here. He didn't frame it as a story. He just gave them the information. "I'm going to spend the first 2 weeks listening more than talking," he said. "I want to understand how this team actually operates before I start suggesting how it should operate differently. If you've got problems, bring them to me directly. If you've got a problem with me, bring that directly too. I'd rather know early than find out later." Bernard said nothing. The others shuffled slightly. A woman named Carla Kim, mid-30s, sharp posture, the particular attentiveness of someone who was going to make her own assessment of him, regardless of what anyone else said. She raised her hand slightly. "What's your background in cybersecurity specifically?" "I did 18 months of coursework," he said, "before I came here. Before that, my background is in physical security, risk assessment, operational logistics under pressure. I know where my gaps are. He looked at her directly, which is why I need to understand who on this team has the technical depth I don't. That'd be mostly Kevin and me, she said. He looked at the man next to her, late 20s, the kind of pale that came from spending most of your time in front of screens, a coffee cup that had clearly been refilled multiple times already before 8 in the morning. Kevin? Yeah. Kevin did not seem particularly invested in the interaction, which Ethan decided to interpret as neutrality rather than hostility. Good, Ethan said. Then we'll be talking a lot. He spent the rest of that first week doing exactly what he'd said, listening. He sat in on the team's daily briefings. He read the reports from the last 18 months, going back through incident logs and response protocols, and the review Reyes had mentioned that had identified gaps nobody had gotten around to filling. He walked the building's physical security infrastructure twice, at different times of day, with different staff. He ate lunch at his desk and asked people questions when they passed his door and went home at 5:30 because Maya had soccer practice on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and he was not the kind of father who missed soccer practice. He also paid attention to the things you couldn't get from reports. There was a tension on the floor that he picked up on by Wednesday. Nothing dramatic, just the specific atmospheric pressure of a room where people were performing a version of their normal behavior rather than operating as themselves. He'd felt it in units before. It usually meant someone in a position of authority was behaving in ways that people had learned to work around without saying so out loud. He started noticing the name on Thursday. Ryan Brooks was VP of Operations, which put him 2 levels above Ethan's direct reporting line, but close enough to the security team's work to have opinions about it. His office was on 41, 1 floor below the executive suite, and he came down to 38 twice in Ethan's first week for reasons that were framed as collaborative check-ins and felt like something else. The first time he'd been cordial in the specific way that costs nothing: introductions, handshake, the usual orientation week pleasantries. He was maybe 40, well-dressed in the way of a man who understood that appearance in corporate environments was a form of communication, with the slightly overpolished affect of someone who'd spent a long time curating how they came across. "Good to have you on board," Brooks said at the end of that first exchange. "Interesting hire." "How so?" A small pause. "Non-traditional background for this kind of role." He smiled. "But Victoria has good instincts." He said it as a compliment. It landed as something else. The specific framing of Ethan's presence as a personal choice of Victoria's rather than a professional decision. The kind of framing that set a category before you'd even gotten started. Ethan let it go. He had 2 weeks of listening before he talked. The second visit, on Friday afternoon, Brooks brought a set of compliance documents that needed security team sign-off and stood at the edge of the open floor while Bernard processed them, making conversation with anyone nearby in the manner of a man who was doing something else under the cover of small talk. Ethan watched him from his office doorway and clocked what he was actually doing, taking inventory, seeing who was talking to the new director and in what manner, and drawing conclusions. He was smart. Ethan gave him that. What Brooks didn't know was that Ethan had spent years in environments where reading a room was a survival skill, and that what looked like a man working a room was, to him, a person showing their hand. He filed it away and kept listening. December arrived, and with it the specific accelerating chaos of a company trying to close out its fiscal year while managing everything that the calendar insisted on happening simultaneously. The security team's workload picked up. Ethan started running morning briefings with tighter agendas, and the department gradually began to feel less like a group of individuals occupying the same space and more like something with shared direction, which was slow work but the right kind. He and Carla had developed a working rhythm by the second week. She would flag the technical issues she thought needed escalation. He would assess them against the operational picture and make the call on resource allocation. She was direct, occasionally impatient, and consistently right about the things she was right about, which was the combination he'd take over diplomatic and unreliable every time. "You're not what I expected," she told him one afternoon, not looking up from her screen. "What did you expect?" "Someone who was going to come in and tell us we were doing everything wrong." She scrolled through something. "That's usually how it goes. New director, 6-week reorganization, half the institutional knowledge walks out the door. What would that accomplish?" "Nothing, but that's usually what happens." I'm not interested in reorganization for its own sake, he said. I'm interested in what actually works. She looked at him then. Okay, she said, in the tone of someone updating an assessment. Kevin, he learned, was 27 and had a graduate degree in information security from Northwestern that he'd finished 2 years ago and which had cost him an amount of money that he mentioned once with a flat, exhausted brevity that communicated everything. He was quiet and technically excellent and had the institutional invisibility that very good introverts often acquired in environments that rewarded louder people. Ethan started specifically asking him to speak in briefings, not to put him on the spot, but to make his expertise visible to the rest of the team. And Kevin responded to this with the cautious opening up of someone who'd learned to expect to be overlooked. Bernard remained Bernard, present, experienced, neither obstructive nor enthusiastic. By the end of the 3rd week, Ethan had placed him, a man who had enough years in to know exactly how much he needed to give, and who would give more if convinced it was worth it. He took him to lunch on a Thursday, at the deli 2 blocks from the building that Bernard had clearly been going to for years, because the woman behind the counter knew his order. They talked about the city, about the team, Bernard's version of the team's history, which was more useful than any report, about what had and hadn't worked under previous directors, which Bernard shared in the tone of someone who'd made peace with things being imperfect and just wanted the current situation to be better than the last one. You're military, Bernard said, at the end of the meal. Not a question. 13 years. Shows, Bernard said, which Ethan took as neutral information. The guys who come in from military usually go one of 2 ways. Either they try to run the place like a unit, which doesn't work in an office, or they overcorrect and try to be everybody's friend. What's the third option? There isn't usually a third option. He took a drink of his coffee. But you haven't done either one yet, so. So, Ethan said. Bernard looked at him. I'm 58 years old, he said. I'm not going to pretend to be enthusiastic about things I'm not enthusiastic about, but I'll tell you what I know and I'll do the work. If that's useful to you. That's useful to me, Ethan said. Something shifted in Bernard's posture, slight, but there. It was in the 4th week that Ryan Brooks stopped being merely watchful and started being something else. It began with a memo. Routine enough on the surface. An inquiry from operations about the security team's response time, protocols for building access incidents, framed as a performance review question. The kind of memo that any reasonable VP might send. But the timing was pointed, arriving 2 days after Ethan had flagged an access control issue in Brooks' department during a building systems review, a weak point in the overnight badging protocol on 39 that Ethan had noted and written up and sent up through the correct channels. He didn't respond to the memo immediately. He documented it and sent a factual response 48 hours later that answered the questions asked and added nothing extra. Then came the meeting. It was framed as cross-departmental coordination. Brooks, Ethan, and 2 of the COO's people in a conference room on 40 for an hour. Standard stuff. Reyes was on the agenda as a note recipient, but the meeting had been scheduled by Brooks' office, which meant Brooks controlled the agenda, and within the first 10 minutes, Ethan understood that the agenda was not coordination. I want to revisit the flagged items from the building systems review, Brooks said. He had a tablet in front of him and the posture of someone who'd prepared. Specifically the items flagged in operations. Happy to discuss them, Ethan said. The badging protocol issue. Brooks pulled it up. My understanding is that the current protocol was established in consultation with the previous security director. The concern I have is that a flag going into the governance record without any prior conversation with my team creates friction. The protocol has a vulnerability, Ethan said. Overnight badge access on 39 doesn't require secondary authentication after 11 p.m. That's a gap in the security posture. That protocol has been in place for 3 years without incident. Most vulnerabilities don't produce an incident until they do. He kept his voice even. The flag isn't a criticism of your department. It's documentation of a technical issue. The fix is straightforward. Brooks smiled, the particular smile of someone who was not actually amused. I understand the technical concern. My point is about process. A new director coming in and flagging items in other departments without consultation can create a perception problem. What perception? that security is operating as an oversight function rather than a support function. One of the COO's people shifted in his chair. The other one looked at the table. Ethan looked at Brooks for a moment. He was very aware of how he was sitting, of his hands flat and still on the conference table, of the temperature of his own voice. "Our job is to protect the company from risk," he said. "Sometimes that means flagging things that other departments prefer weren't flagged. That's not a perception problem. That's the function." The smile again. "Of course. I'm just suggesting that the way we communicate these things matters as much as the things themselves. In a company like this, relationships are how work gets done." "I agree with that," Ethan said, "which is why I'm sitting here talking to you directly." Brooks looked at him for a moment. Something behind his eyes recalibrated. "Fair point," he said pleasantly and redirected the meeting. Driving home that evening, Ethan ran the exchange through his head the way you ran through a debrief. Not dwelling, just extracting the useful information. Brooks was smart, well-positioned, and had been at Hayes Dynamics long enough to have alliances that Ethan couldn't fully map yet. He was also, and this was the part that mattered, worried. You didn't come at someone that carefully, that early, unless you had a reason to be worried about what they might find. He didn't say any of this to Maya, who had a presentation due the next day about penguins, and wanted him to quiz her on facts. He sat at the kitchen table across from her while she held her index cards and told him things about emperor penguins, and he asked follow-up questions, and she corrected him when he got the details wrong. And it was the best part of his day. Victoria Hayes, he discovered, had a habit of moving through her own building in the way that some leaders did. Not performing visible leadership tours, just actually moving. She'd appear in the coffee area on 38 on a Tuesday morning without announcement, pour her own coffee, ask whoever was there a genuine question about what they were working on, and be gone in 10 minutes. She knew enough about the actual work of enough departments to ask questions that weren't generic, which was rare at her level and which Ethan noticed. Their first real conversation after the boardroom happened in that same coffee area, 3 weeks into his tenure, when he came in at 7:30 and found her already there, standing at the counter with a mug and a phone she was reading something on. She looked up. "Walker, how's the team?" "Coming along," he said. He poured his coffee. "Carla Kim is excellent. Kevin Lim has more capability than he's been given room to use. Bernard's a strong institutional resource if you don't mistake low affect for low engagement." She'd lowered her phone. She was listening the way she listened, fully without performing it. "And the gaps?" "Crisis response protocol needs a complete rebuild. The documentation says one thing, and the actual procedure is something different, which is the worst possible version of that problem. Physical security on the lower floors is good. Digital integration with physical systems is not." "How long to fix?" 6 months to do it right. 3 months to patch the worst of it." She nodded. "What's blocking the 6-month version?" "Resource allocation on the technical side. Kevin needs support, and right now he's covering too much ground alone." He picked up his coffee. "I've written it up. It's in the report I sent Reyes last week." "I saw it," she said. "I read all the department head reports." He'd assumed as much, but it was still worth noting. "Then you know the ask." "I know the ask. I'm asking you to make the case to me directly, without the report in between." She looked at him. "I like knowing how my people think when they're not writing for an audience." He thought about it for a moment. Then he laid it out. The technical gaps, what they meant in terms of actual risk, what closing them would require, and why the correct version of the fix was worth the investment over the Band-Aid version. He talked for about 4 minutes and stopped when he'd made the case. She was quiet for a moment. 3 of the resource requests require budget approval from operations, she said. "I know. Ryan Brooks controls that allocation." He looked at her. "I know that too." Something in her expression acknowledged what he was actually saying without either of them making it explicit. "Work through the process," she said. "Document everything. If you hit a wall, bring it to Reyes." "Understood." She picked up her phone again, then she stopped. "How's Maya?" He hadn't expected the question. He hadn't mentioned Maya since the boardroom, when he'd corrected her use of daughter, age 7. "She's good," he said, slightly off balance. "Knows a lot about penguins right now." Something that was almost a smile. "Important knowledge." "She thinks so." Victoria looked at him for another second, and then she was moving. Out the door, already looking at her phone, back into the velocity of being who she was. Ethan stood in the coffee area with his mug and watched her go, and thought that she was not what he'd expected, though he wasn't entirely sure what he'd expected. The escalation with Brooks happened in the 5th week, and when it came sideways, the way the dangerous things usually did. Ethan was in a Tuesday morning briefing with the team when Kevin flagged an anomaly in the network monitoring data. It was subtle, the kind of thing you'd miss if you weren't looking at the right metrics. A pattern of access requests to the financial servers coming from within the internal network, outside of normal business hours, routing through a node that shouldn't have had that level of access clearance. "How long has this been running?" Ethan asked. Kevin pulled up the log. "First instance I can find is 6 weeks ago, but it could be older. Depends on how far back you want me to dig." "Dig back as far as you can, and I want to know which systems have been touched, in what order, and what data was accessible at each access point." "That's going to take a couple of days." "Then start now." Carla was looking at the pattern on the secondary monitor. "This isn't external," she said. "Someone inside the building did this." "Yeah," Kevin said. "That's what makes it interesting." Ethan looked at the access node on the display, 39th floor, operations. He said nothing about that for the moment. He told Kevin and Carla to work it quietly and report directly to him. And he told the rest of the team to proceed with normal operations and not discuss the anomaly outside the room. Then he went back to his office and closed the door and sat at his desk for a long moment. 6 weeks ago was before he'd started. The anomaly predated his arrival. Whatever this was, it wasn't something he'd walked into. It was something he'd walked in on. He called Reyes directly. "I need 30 minutes with you today," he said. "Not by email. In person." Reyes had the calibrated stillness of a good COO. He didn't react to ambiguity, he just managed it. 4:30, he said. "My office." Ethan spent the rest of the day working normally, or appearing to. He responded to emails, attended a scheduled facilities walkthrough, ate his lunch at his desk. He was very aware of the fact that if what he suspected was accurate, then there were people in the building who had reasons to want this thing to stay buried, and that the difference between those people knowing he'd found it and not knowing was the difference between a manageable situation and an unmanageable one. The meeting with Reyes was on the 41st floor, in an office that had the sparse, organized quality of a man who did not let his environment accumulate things. Reyes listened to the whole thing without interrupting, which Ethan appreciated. He walked him through what Kevin had found, what it suggested, and what it didn't yet tell them. He was careful to present it as exactly what it was, a preliminary finding, not a conclusion. When he finished, Reyes was quiet for a moment. "The node is in operations," Reyes said. "Yes." "You're not speculating about who?" "No, the data will tell us who. I'm not going to speculate ahead of the data." Reyes looked at him. "This needs to go to General Counsel." "I agree. And to Victoria." "I'll make those calls." Reyes leaned back slightly in his chair. "You've been here 5 weeks." "I know. This is not the kind of thing you usually find in your first 5 weeks." "Usually I'd agree with you," Ethan said. "But this one wasn't hiding very hard. It was hiding just hard enough to be missed by someone who wasn't looking specifically. The previous review didn't catch it because the previous review was looking at the obvious threat vectors." He paused. "Someone thought that was good enough." Reyes studied him for a moment with the specific attention of a man who was deciding how much trust to extend and how quickly. "Denton will want to run this through formal channels," he said. "Internal investigation, properly documented." "That's the right call." "It'll take time, during which you keep this to your core team and no one else." "Understood." Reyes nodded once. Meeting over in the manner of men who didn't need to fill silence with affirmation. Ethan went back to 38 and sat at his desk in the quiet of the late afternoon, the city outside the window going gray and then dark as the evening came on. He thought about Brooks and his careful smile and his language about relationships and perception problems. He thought about the access node on 39 and the financial servers and 6 weeks of access patterns that had been sitting in the data, patient and invisible, waiting for someone to look in the right place. He thought about the woman in the boardroom who had said, without softness or performance, that she had spent 11 years learning to recognize character, and that what she looked for was a decision made when it was costly. He pulled his phone out and checked the time. If he left in the next 15 minutes, he'd be home before Maya was in bed. He shut down his computer, put on his coat, and took the elevator down. In the lobby, he nodded at the evening security guard, a quiet man named Thomas, who always had a paperback in his front desk drawer, and who nodded back with the recognition of two people who understood that their jobs existed at the hours most other people considered inconvenient. Outside, the Chicago night was clear and bitter, stars invisible behind the ambient glow, but the air sharp enough to confirm they existed somewhere. Ethan turned up his collar and walked toward the L station, and he thought that he had found something that was going to make the next few weeks complicated and uncomfortable and possibly dangerous in the specific corporate sense of things becoming public that powerful people preferred to keep private. He thought about that, and he thought about Kevin and Carla working quietly in the office he'd left behind, pulling threads. And he thought about Reyes making his calls to Denton and to Victoria, and he thought that however complicated it got, he knew exactly what he was doing here and why. That was something he hadn't been able to say about a job in 3 years. He took the stairs to the platform and waited for the train. Kevin worked through the night. Ethan hadn't asked him to. He'd told him to take the data home, work at whatever pace made sense, and report in the morning. But when he came in at 7:15 the next day, Kevin was already at his desk with his third coffee and a legal pad covered in handwritten notes, which Ethan had come to understand was Kevin's system for thinking through problems too complex to hold entirely on a screen. "You stayed," Ethan said. "I went home at 10, came back at 2. Kevin didn't look up. "I couldn't leave it." Ethan pulled a chair over and sat beside him. "What do you have?" Kevin walked him through it in the careful, precise way he had of presenting technical information. Not dumbing it down, but building it sequentially so that the conclusion arrived with the full weight of everything that supported it. The access pattern went back 9 weeks. Whoever had set it up had been methodical, patient, and had known exactly which systems to touch and in what order to minimize the chance of automated alerts triggering. Financial projection data. Vendor contract terms. A proprietary software licensing structure that Hayes Dynamics was currently in negotiation over with a competing firm. They were copying files, Kevin said, not moving them, not deleting them, copying, which means whoever was doing this wanted it to look like nothing was disturbed. Could this be external? Someone who got into the internal network through a compromised credential? Kevin shook his head. I thought about that first. The access patterns are too clean. Whoever did this knew the internal architecture, which nodes had which permission levels, where the monitoring gaps were. That's not someone probing from the outside. That's someone who works here and knows the systems. Or someone who got that information from someone who works here. Kevin looked at him. Yeah, that's also possible. Carla arrived at 7:30, and Kevin walked her through the same sequence. She listened without interrupting and then sat quietly for a moment before she said, "The node is on 39. "Yes," Kevin said. "Operations." "Yes." She looked at Ethan. "How do you want to handle this?" "Denton's team starts the formal investigation today," he said. "Our job is to document what we found, preserve the evidence chain, and stay out of the way of the legal process while making sure nothing gets missed technically." He paused. "That means nobody talks about this outside this room. Not to friends in other departments, not at lunch, not in the elevator, not until Denton says otherwise." Carla and Kevin both nodded. "Kevin, I need everything packaged in a format that a lawyer can work with. Chain of custody documentation, timestamps, the whole procedure. I know how to do that." "I know you do. That's why I'm asking you." Kevin almost smiled. Not quite, but almost. Ethan went to his office and spent the next hour writing his own account of the discovery. When the anomaly was first flagged, what steps were taken, who was involved. He wrote it the way he'd written operational reports in the service. Specific, sequential, without interpretation beyond what the facts supported. He sent it to Denton's office at 9 and received a response at 9:20 that said Denton's team would be in touch, and that no action should be taken that might alert the subject of the investigation. He filed that note and went about his morning. The investigation moved the way legal processes moved, slowly, carefully, with a thoroughness that Ethan respected even when it required patience he had to work to maintain. Denton's team included an outside forensic firm that spent 3 days on 38 with Kevin, going through the same data Ethan's team had already documented, building their own parallel record that would hold up to external scrutiny. During those 3 days, Ethan did something that he'd learned was often more useful than direct action. He watched. Brooks appeared on 38 twice during that period. The first time was the morning after Ethan had sent his report to Denton, early, before most of the team arrived, ostensibly to drop off a document that could have been emailed. He spent 12 minutes on the floor, moving through the space with the ease of a man who believed he belonged everywhere he went, and Ethan watched from his office doorway with his coffee and said nothing. The second time was on day 2 of the forensic review, when Brooks arrived during the lunch hour and found the floor more populated than he'd apparently expected, including 2 people from the outside firm who were sitting with Kevin at the technical station. Something moved through Brooks' expression, fast, controlled, but there. He recovered quickly, made his pleasantries, left a folder with Bernard, and was gone in 5 minutes. After he left, Bernard came to Ethan's door. "That's the 3rd time he's been down here this week," Bernard said, in the tone of a man presenting a fact without drawing a conclusion. "I know," Ethan said. Bernard stood in the doorway for another moment. 58 years old, he said. "I've seen a lot of things in this building." He looked at Ethan. "You need anything from me? You say the word." "I know," Ethan said again. "Thank you, Bernard." Bernard nodded and went back to his desk. The formal notification to Victoria came on a Thursday morning, 10 days after Kevin's initial flag. Denton and Reyes were in the room. Ethan was there because Reyes had asked him to present the technical findings directly. Victoria listened to the full presentation without interrupting. She had the controlled stillness that Ethan had come to associate with her. Not coldness, more like the quality of someone who had trained herself to receive difficult information without letting her reaction contaminate the information itself. When they finished, she was quiet for a moment. "How much exposure?" she asked. "We're still quantifying," Denton said. "The contract terms that were accessed are for the Veritech licensing negotiation. If that data reached the other party, we may have significant leverage loss, potentially 8 to 12 million in negotiated value." "Potentially," Victoria said. "Not confirmed." "Not yet. That's part of what we're working to establish." She looked at Ethan. "Your team found this." "Kevin Lim found it," he said. "I just made sure there was room for him to look." She held his gaze for a moment. "Who do you think did this?" "That's for the investigation to establish," he said. "Not for me to speculate about. I'm asking your assessment, off the record." "There is no off the record in this room right now," he said, and glanced briefly at Denton. Denton cleared his throat. "He's correct." Victoria almost smiled at that. Then she straightened. "What's the next step?" "We need to interview everyone with access to that node on 39, Denton said. "Standard procedure. We've prepared a list." She looked at the list. Her face didn't change. "All right," she said. "Do it." She looked at Ethan one more time before the meeting ended, not communicating anything specific, just looking, the way she'd looked at him on the sidewalk when she'd been trying to commit his face to memory. Then she stood, and the meeting was over. Titam. Ryan Brooks was interviewed on a Friday afternoon. Ethan wasn't in the room. That wasn't his role, and he understood the boundary clearly. He spent that Friday the way he spent most Fridays now, in the building, doing his actual job, letting the investigation run its course through the channels that were designed to handle it. But he was aware of the hour. He couldn't help that. He was at his desk at 3:40 when his phone buzzed. "Reyes, stay in the building. I'll come to you." He stayed. Reyes arrived at 4:15 and closed the office door behind him and sat down in the chair across from Ethan's desk, which he'd never done before. He'd always conducted their conversations standing, the way busy people did when they were between other things. Sitting down meant something. "Tell me what you know about Brooks and the Veritech negotiation," Reyes said. "I know what's in my security files, access pattern, timeline, data that was exposed." He paused. "I haven't gone beyond that." The interview turned up something. Reyes was choosing his words carefully. Brooks claims the access was authorized. He's claiming he received informal approval to review competitive intelligence as part of an operational support function. Informal approval from whom? That's the question. Reyes looked at him. He's named two people. One of them is no longer with the company. The other is currently in a senior role. Ethan kept his face neutral. Did the data show anything about how the access was used, where the files went after they were copied? Forensics found a transfer point, external drive, connected to a terminal in the 39 server room. The drive isn't in evidence. So we have access logs and a transfer event, but no destination. That's correct. Ethan thought about it. The access logs are enough to establish what happened on our end. Whether there was a receiving party, that's a different investigation. Agreed. Reyes looked at him steadily. Brooks is going to make this complicated. He has 11 years in this company, he has relationships, and he's going to use all of it. I know. And the fact that he's been visibly skeptical of your hiring is going to come up. His attorney will make an argument about motive. Ethan leaned back slightly in his chair. The data is the data, he said. I didn't generate the access logs. Kevin found them in a routine review. The forensic firm documented them independently. Whatever Brooks says about my motive doesn't change what the logs show. Reyes nodded. He seemed to be waiting for something else. I'm not interested in going after Brooks, Ethan said. I'm interested in documenting what happened accurately and letting the right people make the right decisions about what to do with it. That's the job. Reyes studied him for a moment. Victoria asked me to tell you something. Okay. She said she knows. Ethan looked at him. He wasn't sure exactly what that covered, but he understood that it was complete. Okay, he said again. Reyes stood up. Board meeting is Monday. You'll need to present the technical findings directly. I'll be ready. After Reyes left, Ethan sat in his office as the building went quiet around him. The Friday afternoon emptying out that buildings did, the gradual reduction in footsteps and voices, and the ambient hum of many people being productive simultaneously. He looked out at the city, which was doing its usual December thing, gray sky, early dark, the lit windows of 1,000 other offices making a grid of warm yellow rectangles against the cold. He thought about Brooks and his careful smile, and his language about perception problems and relationships, and the way he'd walked through the department 3 times in a week, like a man checking on something without being able to check on it directly. He thought about what it must have felt like, to be good at a job, to have built a position over 11 years, and then to have made one decision or a series of small decisions that compounded into something that couldn't be walked back. He'd seen it before, not in corporate offices, but in the service. Good people who did the wrong thing for reasons that made sense to them in the moment, and then spent the next months or years managing the gap between who they were and what they'd done. He didn't feel sorry for Brooks, exactly. But he didn't feel satisfaction either. He just felt the specific, tireless weight of a situation that needed to be handled correctly, regardless of how anyone felt about it. He packed up his desk and went home to his daughter. Yet, Maya had a cold that weekend, not serious. The ordinary childhood cold that turned into a week of interrupted sleep and extra trips to the medicine cabinet, and the particular parenting mathematics of deciding at what temperature you called the doctor versus at what temperature you gave her another half teaspoon of something orange-flavored and sat with her on the couch. They watched movies on Saturday afternoon, Maya wrapped in a blanket with Captain and a box of tissues, making her way through a box of crackers with the focused determination of someone whose appetite was operating at half capacity, but who had committed to eating anyway. "Dad," she said during the second movie. "Yeah." "Is your job going okay?" He looked at her. She was watching the screen, not him, in the way she asked certain questions, sideways so the answer had room to be complicated. "It's going okay," he said. "You've been thinking a lot." "How do you know?" "You do the thing with your jaw." She touched her own jaw briefly. "When something's hard." He hadn't known he did a thing with his jaw. "It's some complicated stuff at work," he said, "but it's manageable." She thought about that. "Are you in trouble?" "No, I'm helping handle something." "Is it dangerous?" "Not the way you mean." She accepted this and went back to the movie. Then, a few minutes later, Does the lady know you're helping? He considered the question. She knows, he said. Maya nodded as if this resolved something. She pulled the blanket tighter around her and ate another cracker, and he thought, not for the first time, that his daughter was going to be something else when she grew up. Something that required a word he hadn't found yet. The board meeting was Monday morning at 9. Ethan spent the weekend preparing the presentation the way he'd spent his career preparing for high-stakes situations, thoroughly, without performing the thoroughness, building toward a version of the material that was as clear and as unassailable as he could make it. He worked at the kitchen table Saturday night while Maya slept, and Sunday morning before she woke up, and he went over it twice more on the train Monday morning. The boardroom was the same room he'd sat in nearly 2 months ago, accepting a job offer across from a woman who'd had a bandage on her forehead and had said she'd spent 11 years learning to recognize character. It felt like longer ago than that. It also felt like something that had happened to a slightly different version of him. A version that had walked into this room uncertain about what he was walking into and had agreed to something on the strength of an assessment made by someone he didn't yet know. He knew her better now. Not fully. He suspected fully was not something easily reached with Victoria Hayes, but better. The board was 12 people, plus Denton, plus Reyes, plus Victoria at the head of the table in the position she occupied in every room she entered regardless of where she was physically sitting. Ethan was the last one in. He took the standing position at the presentation screen and waited for the room to settle. "Thank you for your time," he said when it did. "I'll be presenting the security team's technical findings from the internal review. I'll keep it factual and direct, and I'll answer questions at the end." He presented it in 22 minutes. Timeline, methodology, findings, documentation. He used plain language where he could, and technical language where he had to, and he watched the room as he talked. The board members who leaned forward slightly when the financial exposure numbers came up, the ones who maintained careful neutrality, the one older man in the corner who appeared to be asleep but whose pen was moving. He did not name Brooks as the subject of the investigation. That was Denton's role and Denton's moment, not his. When he finished, there were questions. Some were technical. He answered them. Some were attempts to establish what the investigation had and hadn't proven. He answered those carefully, drawing the line between what the data showed and what remained to be established. One board member, a woman in her 60s with the specific directness of someone who had sat on enough boards to have stopped being patient with evasion, asked him plainly, "In your professional assessment, was this an inside job?" The access patterns and the internal knowledge required to execute them are consistent with an inside source, he said. The investigation is ongoing, and formal conclusions are for general counsel to present. But technically, yes, someone who knows this building did this. The room was quiet for a moment. "Thank you," she said. He sat down. Denton took over. Victoria, at the head of the table, hadn't asked a single question during the presentation. She'd simply listened, and Ethan had been aware of that listening the whole time. Not as pressure, but as a kind of ballast. The investigation produced its formal conclusions 2 weeks later. Ethan was not in the room when they were presented to the board, and he wasn't supposed to be. He was on 38 doing his job. Reyes called him at 2 in the afternoon. "It's done," he said. "How did Brooks respond?" He denied everything until Denton presented the external drive logs from the building's security camera footage, the camera on 39 that records the server room entrance. A pause. The drive was recovered from his car. He'd kept it. Ethan said nothing for a moment. The specific bewilderment of someone keeping the evidence, as though possession of it was protection rather than the opposite. What happens now? His employment is terminated effective today. The legal situation is ongoing. There are discussions about whether the Veritech party received the data and what that means for the negotiation. Another pause. He made a claim in the final interview before the camera footage was presented. He told the investigators that the security review that found the anomaly was conducted in bad faith, that you targeted his department specifically. And the investigators noted that the anomaly was flagged during a routine technical review and documented before any department affiliation was established. Reyes's voice was even. The claim didn't hold. Good. Victoria wants to meet with you. This afternoon, if you can. Tell me when. About it. She was in her office, not the boardroom, her actual office, which was smaller than people imagined it would be, and had a view of the river and a desk that was occupied by two monitors and a controlled accumulation of documents and a single framed photograph that Ethan had never been close enough to see clearly. She was standing at the window when he came in, which seemed to be a position she returned to when she needed to think. She turned when he came in. She looked tired. Not depleted, just the specific tiredness of someone who had carried something difficult through to its conclusion and was now on the other side of it. Sit down, she said. He sat. She stayed standing for another moment, then came away from the window and sat across from him, not behind the desk but in the chair beside it, which was a smaller thing than it sounded. I want to say something to you, she said, and I want to say it clearly so there's no ambiguity. Okay? Ryan Brooks worked for me for 11 years. He was competent. He was effective in a number of ways, and I trusted him with significant responsibility. What he did, what the investigation established, is a betrayal of this company and of me personally. She paused. And he tried to make it about you. He was worried, Ethan said. When someone's worried, they look for a narrative that puts the problem somewhere else. I know why he did it, she said. I want to talk about the fact that he did it and that it didn't work. Not because the investigation was on your side, because the data was on your side, and the data was on your side because you documented everything correctly from the moment Kevin found the anomaly. You didn't cut corners. You didn't act on instinct without backing it up. You built a record that couldn't be argued with. She looked at him steadily. Do you understand what I'm saying? You're saying the work held up. The work held up. And that's not nothing. That's everything in a situation like this. He nodded. She was quiet for a moment. There was something she was working toward. He could feel it. Not evasion, more like someone making sure they were going to say the right thing in the right way. When I was in the hospital, she said, the night after the accident, I kept thinking about you on that sidewalk. Not sentimentally. I kept thinking about the specific thing you did, which was stay. When there was a reason to go. When it cost you something. She stopped. I've been running this company for 8 years and I know a lot of people. Most of them are good at their jobs. Fewer of them are good in that particular way. The way that shows up when there's a cost attached. You don't have to. I know I don't have to. I want to. She looked at him directly. Ryan questioned why you were here. He implied it in meetings, and I think he said it more explicitly to people I haven't talked to yet. And I want to be clear, for myself as much as for you. You are here because I saw something on that sidewalk that I have been trying to find in the people around me for years. And this situation, what happened with the investigation, confirmed it in a way that doesn't need my endorsement to be true. Ethan sat with that. Okay, he said, because it was the truest response he had. She almost smiled. That's all you've got, okay? I appreciate you saying it, he said. I don't know what else to do with it except keep doing the work. That's exactly what you should do with it. They were quiet for a moment. Outside her window, the river was dark, and the bridge lights were reflected in the water in pale strips that shifted with the current. How's the team? She asked. The shift was deliberate, back to ground. Better, he said. Bernard's engaged now in a way he wasn't when I got here. Carla has a structural proposal for the crisis protocol that I think is genuinely strong. Kevin needs a raise. I'll tell HR. He also needs a title that matches what he actually does. Right now, his official role doesn't reflect his function, and that'll be a retention problem. Also fair? She had a notepad somewhere. She found it and wrote something. What else? The digital physical integration project needs budget approval. It was in my report to Reyes in November. I've approved it. Reyes should have that. He hasn't told me yet. He probably wanted to wait until today wasn't complicated. She wrote something else. You'll have it this week. He nodded. She looked at him. Can I ask you something? She said. Yes. When you first came in, the boardroom, the offer, You asked me directly whether this was about what happened on the sidewalk, whether it was personal. I remember. Was that a test? Were you trying to catch me in something? He thought about it honestly. No, he said. It was just what I needed to know before I could make a real decision. Why? Because if it was personal, if it was gratitude dressed up as a professional decision, then it would eventually stop being enough. You'd need me to justify the position on the merits, and I'd be starting from behind. I needed to know what I was actually being offered. She looked at him for a long moment. And now? Now that you've been here 2 months and you've seen how it actually works, do you believe what I told you? He didn't rush it. He thought about the 38th floor and Bernard and Kevin and Carla and the 9 people who were starting to function like a team. He thought about the investigation and the data and the Monday morning board presentation and Reyes sitting down in his office and saying she knows. He thought about this office and this woman and the specific quality of how she listened when you talked to her. Yes, he said. I believe it. She nodded, in the way she nodded when something had been verified rather than merely received. Good, she said. He left her office at 5:20 and rode the elevator down through the building's quiet. On 38, the lights were still on. Kevin was at his station, Carla was on the phone. Bernard was putting on his coat with the unhurried movements of a man who had stopped rushing departures sometime in his 40s. Bernard saw him through the glass and raised a hand. Just that, a raised hand. Ethan raised his back and kept moving toward the elevator. Outside, the evening was cold and clear, the first genuinely clear night in what felt like weeks, and the city was lit up against a sky that was dark blue rather than its usual orange-gray. And Ethan stood on the sidewalk outside the Meridian Tower for a moment before he turned toward the L. He was aware of something that he hadn't been aware of in a long time. Not happiness exactly, not relief. More like solidity. The sensation of standing on something that wasn't moving beneath him. He turned up his collar and walked toward the train. January came in hard. Chicago did that. Gave you a December that was merely cold, manageable. The kind of cold that residents of other cities visited and found bracing and interesting, and then turned around in January and reminded everyone why the lakefront was empty for 5 months of the year. The wind off the water had a quality that wasn't just temperature, but texture, a physical presence that pushed back when you walked into it, and the city moved through it with the particular grim efficiency of people who had made their peace with something they couldn't change. Ethan walked to the L every morning in it and found that he didn't mind it the way he once had. Or maybe he'd just stopped noticing things he couldn't change. Either way, the cold was the cold, and the train came when it came, and he arrived at his desk on 38 at 7:30 with coffee from the place on the corner that had learned his order by the 3rd week of December and now had it ready when they saw him come through the door, which was the kind of small continuity that mattered more than it should have, and he'd stopped pretending otherwise. The team had changed in the months since November. Not dramatically. The people were the same people. The office was the same office. The monitors on the wall displayed the same feeds they'd always displayed. But the atmosphere had shifted in the incremental way that atmospheres shift when a group of people stops performing their roles and starts actually occupying them. Morning briefings ran tight and honest. Problems got raised before they became crises rather than after. Bernard, who had spent 3 years contributing the minimum required, now routinely stayed 20 minutes past his end time because he was in the middle of something he wanted to finish and did it without mentioning it the way people mention things they want acknowledged. Kevin got the raise in December. He also got a title restructure that Ethan and Victoria had agreed on in the meeting after the board presentation. Senior Cybersecurity Analyst, which was accurate and which Kevin had received with the expression of someone who had been told a thing they'd given up expecting to hear. He hadn't said much. He'd gone back to his desk and sat quietly for a few minutes, and then sent Ethan a one-line email that said simply, "Thank you for this." Ethan had read it, filed it, and not mentioned it again, which he understood was how Kevin preferred things handled. Carla's crisis protocol proposal had gone through review in December and been approved in the first week of January. She was 2 weeks into building it out now and was discovering, the way everyone discovered, that the distance between a proposal and an implementation was where all the real work lived. She had the tenacity for it. She also had the specific impatience of someone who could see exactly how it should work and found the pace of making it real frustrating. And Ethan had started stopping by her workspace once a day, not to check on her progress, but to ask one specific question that required her to think out loud, and had found that this was usually enough to keep her from getting too far into her own head. He'd learned their rhythms, and they'd learned his, and that was a different thing from everyone getting along. Getting along was surface. This was operational. The way a good team actually functions, which is less about harmony and more about people trusting that the person next to them will do what they say they'll do every time, without requiring supervision or encouragement. He hadn't built this from nothing. He'd just made enough space for it to build itself. The Veritex situation resolved in January in the specific way that complicated legal and commercial situations resolve. Not cleanly, not with anyone particularly satisfied, but with an outcome that could be lived with. The forensic evidence had established clearly that the contract data had been copied and moved off network from Brooks' department. Whether it had reached Veritex's negotiating team remained, in a legal sense, unproven, though the pattern of Veritex's negotiating positions in the months prior to the investigation suggested strongly that they had known things they shouldn't have. Hayes Dynamics' legal team renegotiated the licensing agreement from a stronger position once the breach was established and disclosed. The final terms were not what they would have been without the breach, but they were better than the terms that Veritech had been pushing for before the investigation, which was the particular math of a situation where the damage was real but the recovery was real too. Brooks hired attorneys. There would be proceedings. Ethan stayed entirely clear of that process, which was where it belonged, in Denton's hands, in the formal channels, in the parts of the institutional machinery that existed precisely to handle things that individuals shouldn't have to carry alone. He answered the questions he was asked by the legal team and provided the documentation they needed and kept the rest of the 38th floor insulated from the ongoing noise of it. He did not feel vindicated by any of it. Vindication implied that he'd been in a contest, which he hadn't been. He'd done the job. The job had produced what it produced. That was the whole thing. What he did feel, what he allowed himself to feel, in the quiet of his apartment after Maya was in bed, was something more like clarity. The specific clarity that comes not from winning, but from having moved through something difficult in a way you could look back on without flinching. He'd made decisions under pressure, and the decisions had been right, and he documented them honestly and presented them without embellishment and let the evidence carry its own weight without trying to direct what it meant. He was aware that this was the thing Victoria had seen in him from the beginning. He was also aware that knowing someone sees something in you is different from being sure you can deliver it, and that the months between November and January had been, in part, the work of finding out whether she'd been right. He thought she had been, not because everything had gone perfectly. It hadn't, not close, but because the things that had gone wrong hadn't changed how he operated. That, he understood now, was what character actually meant. Not that you didn't make mistakes, that the pressure didn't change your direction. He and Victoria had developed over those months the specific kind of relationship that forms between two people who work closely together in high-stakes conditions and are both, by temperament, more honest than they are comfortable. It wasn't easy. Neither of them was easy. She was demanding in ways that she didn't always announce in advance, expecting things at a level that she sometimes forgot to articulate because she assumed competence and then was impatient when the assumption needed more scaffolding than she'd provided. He was direct in ways that occasionally caught people off guard, especially in a corporate environment where directness was often performed rather than practiced. They had, in December, a genuine argument. It was about the security budget for the following fiscal year, specifically about whether the digital integration project could absorb a 10% reduction that finance was pushing and still achieve what it needed to achieve. Victoria had indicated in a meeting that the reduction was workable. Ethan had said, in the same meeting and in front of Reyes and two finance people, that it wasn't. The finance people had gone quiet. Reyes had looked at his legal pad. Victoria had looked at Ethan with an expression he hadn't seen before. Not anger, something more complex. The expression of someone who was not used to being contradicted in a room and was deciding in real time how to feel about it. You're sure about that, she said. Yes, he said. 10% reduction means we extend the implementation timeline by 4 months. In those 4 months, we have a gap in the integration between physical and digital systems that the Brooks situation showed us is a real vulnerability, not a theoretical one. I understand the budget pressure, but I want to make sure the decision is made with accurate information about what it costs operationally. The room was very quiet. All right, Victoria said after a moment. We'll revisit the numbers. After the meeting, she'd come to his office. She'd closed the door. He'd been prepared for various versions of this conversation and found he couldn't quite predict which one was coming. That was uncomfortable, she said. I know. I don't love being contradicted in front of finance. I know that too. I'm sorry for the timing. I should have come to you before the meeting with the operational impact data and given you the chance to make a different call before we were in the room. He paused. That was a process error, and I'll handle it differently next time. She looked at him. You're not apologizing for what you said. No, what I said was accurate. Something shifted in her face. Not softness exactly, more like recognition. No, she said. You're not. That's... She stopped. Most people would apologize for the whole thing and hope I didn't look too closely. That wouldn't help you make a better decision next time. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, The budget stands as originally proposed. I'll manage finance. Thank you. She turned to leave. Then she stopped at the door. Ethan? It was the first time she'd used his first name. He wasn't certain she was aware of it. Yes. This is what I needed, she said. Someone who doesn't manage me. She said it simply, without drama. Just put it on the table and left it there. Then she went back to her floor. He sat with that for a while. It was the kind of thing that, once said, changed the quality of all the subsequent conversations. Not because it created expectation, but because it removed a particular kind of uncertainty. He knew now what he was to her professionally, and knowing it made the rest of it easier to navigate. Easier to be honest, easier to push back when he needed to, easier to support without second-guessing whether the support was what she actually wanted. What he hadn't said, and what he spent some time in January being honest with himself about, was that his feelings about Victoria Hayes had become something that didn't fit entirely inside the professional frame. He'd noticed it incrementally, the way you notice most things that matter, not in one moment, but in accumulation. The way she moved through a room, the way she listened, the way she made her own coffee and never sent for it, and walked her own floors and knew the names of the cleaning staff on 37, and called his daughter Maya when she mentioned her instead of saying your daughter. The way she'd looked at him in the hallway after the boardroom meeting and said, quietly enough that it wasn't for anyone but him, that she knew what it cost. The way she almost smiled, and how you had to be paying attention to catch it. He didn't do anything about any of this. He was her employee. He was aware of the lines that created and of the fact that he was not a person who casually redrew professional lines because it would be convenient. He also didn't know what she felt, and he wasn't going to operate on assumptions. So he did what he generally did with things he couldn't resolve immediately. He put it in a compartment, and he did the work. But Maya turned 8 in February. He took her to the aquarium, her choice, resolutely, rejecting the movie and the indoor trampoline park and the pottery painting place that her friend Jade had raved about. The aquarium, specifically because of the jellyfish. Why jellyfish, he asked, on the bus ride there. Because they don't have brains, she said, and they're still alive. I think that's interesting. He thought about that. That is interesting. Most things that people think are important for living, she said, with the air of someone presenting a conclusion they'd reached after significant thought. Jellyfish don't have, and they've been around for like 600 million years. Where did you learn that? School? She looked at him. Did you know their bodies are 95% water? I didn't know that. So if you dried one out, you'd have almost nothing left. Maya. What? Happy birthday. She grinned. It was her mother's grin, wide and slightly crooked, the kind that took over a face. He'd stopped finding that painful and started finding it simply true, which he understood was a thing that happened with time and which he was grateful for without being able to say exactly when it had happened. They spent 3 hours at the aquarium. He bought her the jellyfish stuffed animal from the gift shop, which she named Gerald on the spot, and carried under her arm for the rest of the day. On the bus home, she fell asleep against his shoulder, which she was getting old enough to be self-conscious about and young enough to still do anyway. And he sat with her weight against him and the city moving past the window and thought about what it had taken to get here. Not here, not the bus. The general here. The shape of his days now compared to the shape of them a year ago. A year ago, he had been lying in the dark, staring at a water stain shaped like Florida, with a dry cleaning bill he wasn't sure he could manage, and an interview confirmation he'd read 4 times because he didn't trust Hope enough to read it just once. He had been a man who was competent at everything and successful at nothing, which was a specific kind of invisible that wore you down in ways that were hard to explain to people who hadn't experienced it. He was still that man. The competence was the same. The history was the same. The knees still tightened in the cold, and he still woke before his alarm, and he still had a tendency, when things got difficult, to go quiet in a way that the people close to him sometimes mistook for withdrawal. He was not a different person. He had not been transformed by circumstances into something better than he'd been before. What had changed was the context, and the context, he understood now, was not a small thing. Spring arrived the way Chicago springs arrived, apologetically, in increments, with several cold reversals that made you doubt it was actually coming before it finally committed. By April, the trees along the river were doing something tentative and green, and the lakefront path was filling up with people who looked faintly surprised to be outside, blinking in the actual sunlight like it was a thing they'd forgotten existed. The Hayes Dynamics annual celebration was in April. Not a Christmas party. Victoria had moved it years ago because she'd found that December events landed badly on people whose lives were complicated in December, which was most people, and that April was a better moment for a company to take stock of itself. The venue was a hotel ballroom downtown, formal enough to communicate respect for the occasion, without being so formal that people couldn't be comfortable. Ethan did not love formal events. He had been to enough of them to perform comfort convincingly, which was its own skill, but performing comfort was not the same as feeling it, and he generally spent the first 40 minutes of events like this recalibrating to the environment. He arrived with Maya, which had not been his original plan, but had become his plan when his backup childcare fell through at 5 p.m., and Maya had said, with complete confidence, that she'd be fine at a party. She was 8. "This is a work event," he'd told her. "You said it was a celebration." "It's a professional celebration." "Dad." She was already straightening his tie, which he found both practical and somewhat uncanny. "I'll be good. I won't say anything embarrassing. That's not what I'm worried about." "What are you worried about?" He looked at her, in the blue dress his sister had sent for her birthday, her dark hair pulled back in the way she'd done herself because she'd decided last month she was old enough to do her own hair and had been proven correct. And he couldn't find a specific answer that didn't sound like something other than what it was, which was just that his work life and his home life had existed in separate compartments for so long that mixing them felt like a logistical risk he hadn't fully planned for. "Nothing," he said. "Let's go." She was in fact fine. Better than fine. She navigated the ballroom with the confidence of a child who had been the only kid in adult situations often enough to know how to operate in them. Polite, curious, not demanding of attention but responsive when it was offered. Bernard found her within the first 20 minutes, and she spent a remarkable amount of time talking to him about Gerald the jellyfish, which Bernard appeared to find genuinely interesting in a way that made Ethan revise upward his assessment of Bernard as a person. Carla stopped by to say hello, and Maya told her, unprompted, that her dad said she was excellent, which Carla received with a lifted eyebrow directed at Ethan that communicated several things at once. Kevin gave Maya a slightly stiff wave from across the room, and she waved back with the generous lack of awkwardness that children were sometimes capable of, and Kevin looked relieved. Ethan moved through the room doing the thing he'd learned to do at work events, present, engaged, neither clinging to one conversation nor bouncing too fast between them. He talked to Reyes for a while about the second quarter, and to Linda Marsh about the HR structure of the new protocol team, and to 2 board members whose names he'd learned but whose faces he'd had to relearn twice. He ate something from the past trays, He drank one drink slowly. Victoria found him at 7:30, near the edge of the room where the windows looked out at the city. She was in something dark green that he registered peripherally, and then stopped registering because he was looking at her face, which had the particular quality it sometimes got in the evenings, less guarded than during the day, the working surface of her expression slightly relaxed. "Your daughter is telling Bernard about jellyfish," she said. "I know. I think he's learning things." "He looks engaged." She stood beside him, both of them facing the room. "She's like you." "Everyone says she's like her mother." "In some ways, maybe, but the way she moves through a room, she's assessing it, figuring out how it works before she decides how to operate in it." She glanced at him. "That's you." He didn't know what to do with that, so he let it sit. "The team was recognized tonight," she said. "In Reyes's remarks, did you hear?" "I heard." "How did that land for you?" "Fine." He thought about it honestly. "Good, actually. Not for me, for them. Kevin especially. He doesn't get recognized enough." She was quiet for a moment, then, "I want to talk to you about something." "Okay." "Not here." She glanced around the room. "There's a terrace. Come out in 5 minutes." She drifted away before he could respond, which was something she did, initiating things and then moving before they could become an exchange, which kept her in control of the pacing. He'd noticed this about her and had also noticed that she did it less with him than she did with other people, which he'd filed away without interpreting. He found Maya, checked on her, confirmed she was fine, and in fact currently being shown something on Bernard's phone that appeared to be a nature documentary. He told her he'd be on the terrace for a few minutes, and she waved him away with the distracted confidence of someone who was busy. The terrace was off the east side of the ballroom. Not large, a strip of outdoor space with a stone railing and a view of the city that was the kind of view you stopped noticing if you saw it every day and hadn't stopped noticing because you hadn't been seeing it every day long enough to take it for granted. April in Chicago at night, still cool, the air smelling like rain that had happened earlier and the faint green smell of things deciding to come back. Victoria was standing at the railing. She'd gotten a glass of wine from somewhere and was holding it without drinking it. He came to stand beside her. Below them, the city did what it did, moved, lit, continued. "I said something to you in December," she said, "that you don't manage me. Do you remember?" "I remember." "I've been thinking about that." She turned the wine glass slightly in her hand. "I've been thinking about it because I've never said that to anyone before, which is partly because it hasn't been true, and partly because even when it was true, it wasn't something I felt safe saying out loud." She paused. "Do you know what I mean by that?" He thought he did. He said so. "When you're in this position," she made a small gesture that encompassed the building, the company, the accumulated weight of what she ran. "People relate to what you have, what you represent. Some of them want something from it, and some of them are just uncomfortable with it, and they handle that discomfort by performing a version of themselves around you that isn't quite real." She stopped. "You don't do that." "I've noticed you don't make it easy to perform," he said. "No." She almost smiled. "I've been told that." "Is that what you wanted to talk about?" She looked at him. The city was lit up behind her and the air was cool, and she was looking at him the way she sometimes did, like she was rechecking something she'd already checked before. "I don't do this well," she said. "I want to say that first. I'm not—" She stopped. Started again. "The last relationship I was in ended because the person eventually told me that being with me was like being adjacent to a force of nature. He meant it as a compliment. I understood it as accurate and also as a reason things couldn't work." A pause. "I've been alone for 4 years. Not because I haven't met people. Because most of the time I couldn't find anyone whose company felt more valuable than the absence of the complications that come with company." Ethan stood still and listened and let her get there in her own time. "And then," she said, "I was on a wet sidewalk in November, and a man I'd never met got on his knees in the rain and talked to me in a calm voice and pressed his jacket against my head and stayed." She said it without drama, just as the fact it was. "And everything that came after that, the way you work, the way you handle things, the conversation about the budget in that conference room." She stopped. You're the first person in a very long time whose company feels like more. He didn't say anything for a moment. He thought about the compartment he'd been keeping, the careful distance he'd maintained because the lines were real and he respected them. He thought about the December morning in the coffee area when she'd said Maya's name like she was filing it away, and he'd noticed and not let himself do anything with the noticing. "I need to say something back," he said. "All right. I'm not going to pretend I haven't been thinking about this. I have." He looked at her directly. "But I need you to understand what it means, on my side. I have a daughter. My life is not uncomplicated. I can't do anything casually. That's not a limitation I'm apologizing for. It's just the truth about who I am." "I know who you are," she said. "I've been watching for 5 months. And it doesn't, Ethan." It was quiet and direct, and it stopped him. "I'm not asking you for casual." He looked at her. The city was quiet in the way cities got at a distance when you were above the street noise, and what was left was just the hum of something enormous being continuously alive. Her eyes were dark and direct, and he knew this face now. He'd seen it in a boardroom and a coffee area and a hallway and an office, and he knew the difference between the working face and this one. "Okay," he said. "Is that all you have?" she said, and there was something in her voice that was almost laughter. "I'm working on the rest of it," he said. She did smile then, really smiled, the full thing, which he realized he'd never quite seen before. It changed her face in a way he hadn't anticipated and would have been difficult to describe accurately. "Take your time," she said. He did something he hadn't planned, which was that he reached over and took the hand that wasn't holding the wine glass and held it, and that was where they stood for a while. Two people at a railing above a lit city in April, not saying anything, not needing to. Inside, Maya had found the dessert table. Ethan discovered this when he came back in and located her by the simple method of following Bernard, who was carrying a small plate of something chocolate and heading toward the corner where Maya had apparently established herself as a person worth talking to. She had Gerald the jellyfish under one arm and a piece of cake in the hand, and she was in conversation with two women Ethan recognized from the marketing floor who were listening to her with the specific attention that adults sometimes gave children who were saying something genuinely interesting. He stood at the edge of the ballroom and watched her for a moment. 8 years old, dark hair, her mother's grin, his tendency to assess a room before committing to it. A stuffed jellyfish named Gerald, and a brain full of facts about creatures that had survived 600 million years without any of the things people thought were necessary for survival. A child who told him he was going to get it with flat certainty when he was scared, and who asked the right questions sideways so the answers had room to be complicated, and who had been self-sufficient in small ways for too long because he'd been too stretched to give her the luxury of not being. He thought about what the next year might look like, the year after, the ways that things had changed and the ways they hadn't, and the ways they might continue to change if he kept doing the work the way he knew how to do it, and stopped being afraid of what came next. He thought about a rainy November morning and a wet sidewalk and a woman with blood on her forehead in the specific instant, the instant that was the size of a breath, when he had checked his watch and looked at the tower and looked at the woman and made the only decision he could have lived with. People would tell that story and make it about what he'd gained from it. The job, the position, the steady paycheck, and the team that was finally functioning, and the woman on the terrace who had said she was not asking for casual. They would make it a story about reward, the good thing repaid. But he knew what the moment had actually been. It had not been a calculation. It had not been a bet on the future or a test he passed to earn something. It had been what it looked like. A man seeing a situation clearly and responding to it honestly. A woman hurt, a sidewalk, a choice. The reward, if you wanted to call it that, was not what followed from the choice. The reward was being the kind of person who made the choice in the first place. That was the thing you couldn't take away, and couldn't buy, and couldn't perform your way into being. You either were it or you weren't, and if you were, then no amount of failure and rejection and closed doors and missed interviews and ruined jackets and flat-broke Tuesday mornings could make you not be it. That was the thing he hadn't understood fully until now. He'd understood it intellectually. The service had given him the language for it. But he hadn't felt it as a solid thing, a weight he could put his hand on, until these months had pressed on it from all sides and it had held. Victoria came back inside from the terrace and moved through the room the way she always moved, with the particular velocity of someone entirely at home in her own forward motion. And at one point she caught his eye from across the ballroom and held it for just a moment before she was pulled into a conversation and he was left with the warm aftermath of it. Maya appeared at his elbow. "Did you eat anything?" she said. "I had some things from the trays. There's chocolate cake." She held up her plate as evidence. "It's good." "I believe you." She looked up at him. She had cake on her chin, which she was unaware of and which he decided not to mention yet. She had the expression she got sometimes, the too serious, slightly too perceptive expression that made people comment on how old she seemed for her age, which he'd always found a complicated compliment. Kids who seemed old for their age had usually had reasons to get there. "Dad," she said. "Yeah. I like it here." She looked around the room, taking inventory in her particular way. "The people are nice. Most of them. That man Bernard is very interesting." "He is. He knows a lot about Chicago, like the history." "Bernard's been here a long time." She ate the last bite of cake and transferred Gerald from under her arm to in front of her, holding him by the torso the way she held him when she was thinking. "Are we going to stay here?" she said. "I mean, like, in Chicago. In this—" She gestured vaguely, which he understood to mean not just Chicago, but the general shape of their life right now. He looked at her. The question had the weight of something she'd been carrying for a while. "Yeah," he said. "We're staying." She nodded once, in the decisive way she had when she'd been checking something and gotten the answer she was hoping for. Then she looked back up at him. "She's nice," she said, carefully casual. "Victoria." He kept his face even. "You talked to her." "She came and found me." Maya looked at Gerald. She asked what his name was. "What did you tell her?" "Gerald?" She paused. She said it was a good name, that Gerald was probably a jellyfish who made good decisions. Another pause, this one longer. "I think she meant something else by that." "She might have." Maya looked at him for a moment with those too serious eyes. Then she smiled, the wide, slightly crooked smile that was her mother's and no one else's. "Okay," she said, which was his word and his cadence, and which she'd been borrowing since she was old enough to understand that it meant more than it sounded like. He reached over and wiped the cake off her chin, and she let him. Around them, the ballroom continued its hum, people talking and laughing and refilling their glasses and doing the work of being in a room together that organizations sometimes forgot was actually the thing that held them functional. Underneath all the strategy and the process and the documents that described how everything should work, the human part, the unreportable, unquantifiable, can't put it in a budget human part that was either there or wasn't and made all the difference. Ethan Walker stood in the middle of it with his 8-year-old daughter and her jellyfish named Gerald and watched Victoria Hayes move through the room that she'd built. And he thought about what it had taken to get here and what here actually was and what it might become. He'd spent 3 years starting over. He'd spent 13 years before that learning how to move toward hard things without breaking stride. He'd spent a lifetime probably being the kind of person who stopped on wet sidewalks for strangers, not because he expected anything from it, but because the alternative, the version of himself who kept walking, was not a version he could inhabit. And all of that had led here, not as a reward, as a consequence, as the natural and unpredictable result of a man living as close to honestly as he could manage, in circumstances that made honesty harder than it should have been, without letting the hardness change his direction. The greatest victories, he understood now, were the ones nobody saw coming, not because they were secret, because they looked from the outside like ordinary things. A man stopping on a sidewalk, a choice made in the space of a breath, a Tuesday morning that turned, without announcement, into the rest of his life. He touched Maya's shoulder lightly, and she leaned into it without looking up from Gerald, and across the room Victoria Hayes looked up and found him, as she'd been finding him all evening, as if she'd known each time exactly where he was. and she held the look for a long, steady moment before the room moved and carried both of them forward, together, into whatever was next.